Elizabeth Montgomery stood at the panoramic window of her penthouse, absently stroking the cool glass. New York City, the city she'd come to think of as her own, stretched out below. Her gaze glided over the skyscrapers, among which the buildings of her own hotel empire stood out. "Mrs. Montgomery," came a voice behind her, "your coffee." Elizabeth turned slowly. Her personal assistant, Jessica, stood with a tray on which a cup of espresso was smoking. "Thank you, Jessica," Elizabeth replied, accepting the cup. "What are our plans for today?" Jessica opened her clipboard and began listing. "At 10 o'clock you have a meeting with the board of directors regarding the opening of a new hotel in Dubai. At 12:30, lunch with the mayor. At 3 p.m., an interview for Forbes. She stammered. At 6 p.m. you have an appointment with Dr. Elliot." Elizabeth tensed. "Cancel the visit with Dr. Elliot. I don't have time for that." "But Mrs. Montgomery," Jessica objected cautiously, "this is the third time you've canceled an appointment." Dr. Elliot insisted. "I said cancel it," Elizabeth cut her off sharply. "And get me some aspirin. My head is splitting again." Jessica nodded and hurried away. Elizabeth returned to the window, but now her gaze was focused on her own reflection. She looked flawless, as always. Expensive Chanel suit, perfectly styled, makeup on. But something in her eyes gave away her anxiety. The phone rang. Elizabeth glanced at the screen. It was her husband, Michael. "Yes, darling?" she answered, trying to make her voice sound as casual as possible. "Liz, did you cancel your appointment with James?" Michael could hear the concern in her voice. "I don't have time for that, Michael. You know how much work I have." "Liz, we've talked about this. You can't keep ignoring—" "I'm not ignoring anything," Elizabeth interrupted him. "I'm just busy. I have an empire to run. I can't waste time on useless doctor's appointments." "Useless?" Michael said indignantly. "Liz, your health is more important than any empire. Please promise me you'll go to James." Elizabeth sighed. "All right, I'll think about it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting." She hung up without waiting for her husband's reply. Elizabeth covered her eyes for a second, trying to deal with the growing headache. When she opened them, her gaze fell on the picture on the table, her, Michael, and their daughter Rachel on vacation in Italy. That was 2 years ago, before. Elizabeth resolutely turned away from the photograph. No, she will not let weakness take over. She is Elizabeth Montgomery, and she has a job to do. The day flew by as usual, in a stream of meetings, calls, and decisions. Elizabeth was in her element, running her empire with ruthless efficiency. But by evening, the headache had gotten so bad that even she couldn't ignore it. Already in her office, Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, massaging her temples. Suddenly the door opened and Rachel walked in. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked, stepping closer. Elizabeth straightened up, trying to look cheerful. "Of course I am, dear. Just a little tired. What are you doing here so late?" Rachel sat down on the edge of the table. "Dad asked me to stop by. He's worried about you. We're all worried." Elizabeth shook her head. "There's no reason to worry. I'm perfectly fine." "Mom," Rachel took her hand, "you can't go on like this. We know you're canceling appointments with Dr. Elliot. It's irresponsible." "Irresponsible?" Elizabeth stood up abruptly. "Irresponsible is wasting time on unnecessary medical appointments when I have a company to run. A company I built from the ground up that you will one day inherit." "But what's the point of that if you—" Rachel stammered. "If I what?" Elizabeth squinted. Rachel took a deep breath. "If you're not healthy enough to enjoy the fruits of your labor." For a moment, fear flashed in Elizabeth's eyes, but she quickly pulled herself together. "I appreciate your concern, dear, but I know what I'm doing. Now, if you don't mind, I need to finish my work." Rachel realized the conversation was over. She stood up and headed for the door, but stopped on the threshold. "We love you, Mom. Please remember that." When the door closed behind her daughter, Elizabeth sank back into her chair. Her gaze fell on the family photo, and suddenly she felt a lone tear roll down her cheek. The next morning began for Elizabeth as usual, with a cup of strong coffee and a look at the financial news. But something had changed. The conversation with Rachel was not getting out of her head. She was sitting at her huge mahogany desk, absent-mindedly reviewing reports when Jessica walked into the office. "Mrs. Montgomery, I have some important messages for you," she began. Elizabeth raised her hand, stopping her. "Hold on, Jessica. I want you to do something for me." Jessica raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Of course, anything. I want you to find me a regular clinic. Not private, not high-end. A regular clinic where regular people go." Jessica looked puzzled. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Montgomery, but why do you need a regular clinic? You have the best doctors in town." Elizabeth stood up and walked over to the window. "That's exactly why, Jessica. I want to get an independent opinion, without bias, without regard to my status or money." "But," Jessica began. "No buts," Elizabeth cut her off sharply. "Find a clinic and get me an appointment under a different name, and not a word about this to anyone, understand?" Jessica nodded, though it was obvious she was still confused. "Yes, Mrs. Montgomery. I'll get right on it." When Jessica left, Elizabeth turned to the window again. Her reflection looked back at her with defiance. "You can handle it," she whispered to herself. "You're Elizabeth Montgomery, damn it." 3 days later, Elizabeth stood in front of the mirror in her huge walk-in closet, critically examining her reflection. Instead of her usual designer suit, she was wearing simple jeans and a sweater. Her hair, usually styled in an elaborate style, was gathered into a simple ponytail. No makeup. Michael entered the room and stopped in surprise. "Liz, what are you wearing?" Elizabeth turned to him with a strained smile. "Oh, I have a meeting tonight. Informal." Michael frowned. "What kind of informal meeting? You don't have informal meetings." "I do, see?" Elizabeth tried to speak easily. "I've decided to. A little different approach." Michael stepped closer, his face expressing concern. "Liz, what's going on? You haven't been yourself lately." Elizabeth closed her eyes for a moment. Part of her wanted to tell her husband the truth, to share her fears and doubts. But the years spent building an image of a strong and invulnerable woman had taken their toll. "It's okay, Michael," she said, opening her eyes and pulling on a smile. "Really, I'm just experimenting." Michael looked unconvinced, but decided not to insist. "Okay, if you say so. But you know you can tell me anything, right?" Elizabeth nodded, feeling a prick of guilt. "Of course, darling. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go." She gave her husband a quick kiss on the cheek and left the room, leaving Michael standing in bewilderment. The clinic Jessica had found was located in an unremarkable building in one of New York City's working-class neighborhoods. Elizabeth parked her unremarkable rental car. She had declined the services of a driver for this mission and sat for several minutes gathering her wits. "You can do this," she whispered to herself. "You're Elizabeth Montgomery. You've handled worse." Finally, she got out of the car and headed toward the clinic entrance. Inside, she was greeted by the hustle and bustle of an ordinary city hospital, something Elizabeth hadn't encountered in years. She walked up to the front desk where a tired-looking nurse sat. "Hello?" Elizabeth said, trying to make her voice sound casual. "I have an appointment. In the name of Elizabeth Smith." The nurse didn't even look up, just ran her fingers over the keyboard. "Yes, I see. Fill out these forms and wait to be called." Elizabeth took the forms and sat down in the crowded waiting room. All around her were people of all ages and social classes. Young mothers with children, elderly couples, working people in overalls. She felt strangely out of place. Elizabeth was used to being the center of attention, but here no one was even looking in her direction. It was both intimidating and liberating. As she filled out the forms, she was surprised to realize that she couldn't remember some basic things about her health. When was the last time she had the flu? What medications does she take regularly other than aspirin for headaches? These simple questions got her thinking about how far she drifted away from her own body, immersed in the world of business and power. "Elizabeth Smith," came the voice of a nurse. Elizabeth flinched, not immediately recognizing her alias. She stood up and followed the nurse down the long hallway. The walls were painted a faded green, the paint peeling in places. The smell of disinfectants was everywhere. It was so different from the sterile luxury of the private clinics she was used to. A nurse led her into a small office and said, "Dr. Thompson will be here shortly. Please have a seat." Left alone, Elizabeth looked around. The office was small and functional, nothing superfluous. On the walls hung posters with information about healthy living and disease prevention. One of them caught her eye. "Early detection saves lives." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. The door opened and a young woman in a white coat entered the office. Her brown hair was gathered into a careless bun, and a welcoming smile played across her face. "Hello, Mrs. Smith. I'm Dr. Sarah Thompson. What brings you to us today?" Elizabeth was confused for a moment. She had been so focused on getting here incognito that she had almost forgotten to think of a reason for the visit. "Yeah, I get headaches a lot," she began uncertainly. "And I feel tired all the time. It's probably just stress." "But," Dr. Thompson nodded, making notes in her notebook. "I see. Let's start with a basic exam, and then we'll talk more about your symptoms." The next half hour passed in routine procedures, taking her blood pressure, listening to her heart and lungs, checking her reflexes. It was strange for Elizabeth. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had such a simple but thorough checkup. "Good, Mrs. Smith," Dr. Thompson said as she finished her examination. "Now let's talk in more detail. How long have the headaches been bothering you?" Elizabeth hesitated. "Honestly, I'm not sure. Maybe a few months, or longer. I'm used to ignoring such things." Dr. Thompson frowned. "Ignoring your health is not the best strategy, Mrs. Smith. Can you describe the nature of the pain? Is it constant or does it come in attacks?" "It usually starts as a slight pressure and then intensifies," Elizabeth replied. "Sometimes it gets so intense that I can barely concentrate." "And the fatigue? When did you start noticing it?" Elizabeth sighed. "I've always worked hard, so fatigue is nothing new to me. But lately, it seems like no matter how much sleep I get, it's not enough." Dr. Thompson continued to ask questions, and Elizabeth was surprised to find herself telling her things she hadn't even told her personal physician. About how sometimes she felt dizzy, about the moments when she couldn't remember simple things, about the strange numbness in her fingers that she wrote off as long hours on the computer. "Mrs. Smith," Dr. Thompson finally said, "given your symptoms, I'd like to schedule you for some additional tests, specifically an MRI scan of your brain." Elizabeth felt her heart skip a beat. "An MRI? You think it's something serious?" Dr. Thompson smiled softly. "It's too early to draw any conclusions at this stage. The MRI will help us rule out some potential causes of your symptoms. It's standard procedure in cases like this." Elizabeth nodded, feeling a lump come up to her throat. "Okay, when can I have this test done?" "There's usually a waiting list for MRIs, but we have an open window tonight, if you can." "Yes," Elizabeth answered quickly. "Yes, I'll be there." As she walked out of the office, the reality of what was happening began to roll over her in waves. She, Elizabeth Montgomery, was about to undergo an MRI at a regular city hospital under someone else's name. What was she doing? Why didn't she just go to Dr. Elliott? But deep down inside, she knew the answer. Because here, in this clinic, she was just a patient. Not a billionaire, not the head of a corporation, not someone who needed to be protected from bad news. Just a person who wanted to know the truth about her health. Elizabeth stepped outside and took a deep breath. She had a few hours until tonight. A few hours to decide if she was actually ready to know the truth. The evening came all too quickly. Elizabeth spent several hours wandering aimlessly around the city, trying to gather her thoughts. She walked into a small cafe where no one recognized her, and for the first time in a long time, she just sat there, watching the ordinary people around her. Their conversations, their laughter, their worries, it all seemed so far removed from her world, and yet, at the same time, she felt closer to them now than ever before. When it was time to head back to the clinic, Elizabeth felt strangely calm. Whatever the MRI showed, she would get through it. She had always handled it. A nurse met her at the clinic and escorted her to the radiology department. The procedure to prepare for the MRI was quick and businesslike. Elizabeth removed all metal objects, put on a hospital shirt, and lay down on the machine's narrow platform. "Try to lie still," the technician said. "The procedure will take about 30 minutes. If you become uncomfortable, let me know." The platform began to move, and Elizabeth found herself inside the machine's cramped tube. Closing her eyes, she tried to focus on her breathing, ignoring the loud thumping and humming of the machine. In these moments of enforced stillness and silence, Elizabeth's thoughts wandered. She thought about her life, about the decisions that had brought her here, about the company she had built, about the family she'd been so often estranged from for work, about what really mattered. When the procedure was over, Elizabeth felt exhausted but strangely refreshed. She dressed and walked out into the hallway where Dr. Thompson was waiting for her. "Mrs. Smith, thank you for agreeing to this procedure so quickly," the doctor said. "The results will be ready in a few days. I'll call you as soon as I have them in my hands." Elizabeth nodded. "Thank you, Dr. Thompson. I appreciate your help." Walking out of the clinic, Elizabeth took her time getting into her car. Instead, she just stood on the sidewalk, watching the evening city. People were rushing home from work. Couples were walking around holding hands. Music was playing somewhere in the distance. Ordinary life went on, and Elizabeth suddenly realized how much she missed that simplicity. Taking out her cell phone, she dialed a number. "Michael, it's me. Listen, I think we need to talk. Can you meet me at home?" When Elizabeth arrived home, Michael was already waiting for her in the living room. His face expressed concern and confusion. "Liz, what's going on? You've been missing all day, not answering your cell phone. Rachel called. She's worried too." Elizabeth took a deep breath and sat down next to her husband. "Michael, there's something I need to tell you. I was at the hospital today." Michael tensed. "What? Why didn't you tell me? Did something happen?" No, not really," Elizabeth shook her head. "I went to a regular clinic, under a false name." She began to tell him everything, her fears, her decision to go to the regular clinic, her meeting with Dr. Thompson, and the MRI. Michael listened without interrupting, only squeezing her hand tighter. "Liz, why didn't you share this with me sooner?" he asked when she finished. Elizabeth felt tears come to her eyes. "I don't know, Michael. I'm used to being strong, solving all my problems on my own. I thought that if I ignored it, it would just go away. But now I realize how stupid that was." Michael put his arm around her. "You don't have to go through this alone, Liz. We're a family. We're together no matter what happens." They sat like that for a while, just holding each other. Finally, Elizabeth pulled away and wiped her eyes. "I need to call Rachel," she said. "She deserves to know the truth." Michael nodded. "Let's call her together. And Liz, whatever the results show, we can handle it. Together." Elizabeth smiled weakly. For the first time in a long time, she felt the weight on her shoulders become a little lighter. The next few days were filled with a strange mixture of anxiety and relief. Elizabeth took a vacation, for the first time in years. She spent time with her family, walked around town, even started reading a book that had been sitting on her bedside table for months. Rachel came home, putting all her chores aside. In the evening, they all sat together in the living room, talking as frankly as they hadn't talked in a long time. "Mom, I don't understand," Rachel said. "Why didn't you go to Dr. Elliott? I mean, he's been our family doctor for so many years." Elizabeth thought for a moment, choosing her words. "You know, sweetheart, sometimes we need a fresh set of eyes. Someone who doesn't know us, our history, our situation. Someone who will just see the problem for what it is." Michael nodded, supporting his wife. "Your mom's right, Rachel. Sometimes we get so used to a certain way of life that we lose touch with reality, with what really matters." Rachel looked at her parents carefully. I'm scared, Mom. What if it's something serious?" Elizabeth reached out and gently stroked her daughter's cheek. "Honey, whatever it is, we'll get through this, together, I promise." That evening was a turning point for the Montgomery family. For the first time in a long time, they weren't talking about business, money, or status, but about their feelings, fears, and hopes. Elizabeth caught herself thinking that perhaps this situation, as frightening as it was, could be the beginning of something new and important for their family. The next few days dragged agonizingly slowly. Elizabeth tried to keep herself busy so she wouldn't constantly think about the upcoming results. She started practicing yoga, something she had never done before, thinking it was a waste of time. To her surprise, the exercise helped her to calm down and focus. Michael tried to be around as often as possible. They cooked dinner together, something they hadn't done in years, relying on the staff. These simple domestic activities brought them strangely closer together, reminding them of the times when they were a young couple just starting out. Rachel had changed too. She began to talk less about work and career, instead spending more time with her parents. One night she suggested they have a family movie night, a tradition they had abandoned years ago. "Remember how we used to watch movies together every Friday night?" Rachel asked, settling down on the couch with a large bowl of popcorn. Elizabeth smiled, feeling a prick of nostalgia. "Of course I remember. You always insisted on cartoons. And you always fell asleep in the middle," Michael teased, putting his arm around his wife's shoulders. They chose an old comedy that everyone had seen more than once, but that still made them laugh. Sitting there, surrounded by her family, Elizabeth felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Despite the uncertainty of the future, she was grateful for this moment, for this opportunity to just be herself, without masks or expectations. The next morning, as Elizabeth was preparing breakfast, another new activity for her, the phone rang. When she saw the number for the clinic, she felt her heart drop into her heels. "Hello?" she answered, trying to keep her voice sounding calm. "Mrs. Smith, this is Dr. Thompson. The results of your MRI are in. Would you be able to come in today to discuss them?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. "Yes, of course. What time?" They made an appointment for 2 hours later. After hanging up, Elizabeth just stood looking out the window for a few minutes. Then she called out to Michael and Rachel. "The results are in," she said as they entered the kitchen. "I'm going to the clinic in 2 hours." Michael immediately came over and gave her a hug. "I'm coming with you." "Me too," Rachel said firmly. Elizabeth shook her head. "No, I have to do this on my own, but I'll tell you all about it as soon as I get back. I promise." Michael looked like he wanted to object, but then nodded. "Okay, but we'll wait for you here." The next 2 hours passed like a blur. Elizabeth showered, dressed, again choosing simple clothes instead of her usual designer outfits, and drove to the clinic. In the waiting room, she nervously rubbed the strap of her bag as she waited to be called. There were other patients around, some looking calm, some nervous, just like her. Elizabeth suddenly realized that here, in this ordinary clinic, they were all equal. The disease didn't distinguish between rich and poor. Mrs. Smith, a nurse called out, and Elizabeth stood up, feeling her knees shake. Dr. Thompson greeted her with the same kind smile as the first time. "Hello, Mrs. Smith. Have a seat." Elizabeth sat down, clasping her hands in her lap. "Dr. Thompson, please just tell me, what did the MRI show?" Dr. Thompson opened the results folder. "Mrs. Smith, on the scans we found a small mass in your brain. That would explain your headaches and other symptoms." Elizabeth felt the world around her stop for a moment. "A mass? You mean a tumor?" Dr. Thompson nodded. "Yes, but I want you to understand. It doesn't necessarily mean the worst-case scenario. The mass is small, and based on its location and characteristics, there's a good chance it's benign." Elizabeth took a deep breath, trying to comprehend what she'd heard. What now?" "Now we need to run more tests to determine the exact nature of the mass and develop a treatment plan. I would recommend a biopsy." Dr. Thompson continued to speak, explaining the next steps, the possible treatment options, but Elizabeth heard her as if from a distance. "I have a brain tumor." When Dr. Thompson finished her explanation, she gently touched Elizabeth's arm. "Mrs. Smith, I realize this is shocking news, but I want you to know, we have every reason to be optimistic. Medicine has made great strides in treating cases like this." Elizabeth nodded, trying to gather her thoughts. "Thank you, Dr. Thompson. I need some time to process all of this." "Of course," the doctor replied. "Here's information on next steps and contacts for the specialist you'll need to contact. And, Mrs. Smith, don't forget that you are not alone in this struggle." Leaving the office, Elizabeth didn't immediately walk toward the exit. Instead, she found a quiet corner in the hallway and sat down on a bench. She pulled out her cell phone, intending to call Michael, but instead she just sat there staring at the screen. At that moment, a young woman walked by with a little boy. The child was bald, obviously undergoing chemotherapy, but a bright smile shone on his face. He was cheerfully telling his mom something, waving his arms. The sight turned something in Elizabeth's soul. If this little boy could smile and enjoy life despite his illness, so could she. She stood up, squared her shoulders, and dialed Michael's number. "Michael, I'm on my way home. We need to talk." When Elizabeth got home, Michael and Rachel were waiting for her in the living room. You could see by their faces how worried they were. "Mom?" Rachel jumped up as soon as Elizabeth entered the room. Elizabeth took a deep breath and sat down between her husband and daughter. "I have a brain tumor," she said bluntly. Michael drew in air sharply, and Rachel let out a quiet shriek. "But," Elizabeth continued, taking their hands, "Dr. Thompson thinks there's a good chance it's benign. We have many more tests to go through, but there is hope." She spent the next hour telling them everything she'd learned from Dr. Thompson, about the size of the tumor, the treatment options, the next steps. Michael and Rachel listened intently, asking questions and not letting go of her hands. "What are we going to do now?" Rachel asked when Elizabeth finished the story. Elizabeth looked at her family and suddenly felt a surge of determination. "We're going to fight, together. But first," she stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. "First, we have to decide how we want to live our lives. Regardless of what further tests show, one thing I've realized is that life is too short to spend it just working and chasing success." Michael walked over and hugged her from behind. "What do you suggest, darling?" Elizabeth turned toward them. "I want to change our lifestyle, spend more time together, maybe travel, take up charity work, not just donating money, but actually helping people." Rachel looked surprised. "What about the company?" "The company is important, but it doesn't have to be everything," Elizabeth replied. "We can find a way to run it without sacrificing our lives and health." Michael nodded. "I agree. We've lived too long with work. It's time for a change." Rachel was silent for a while, mulling over her mother's words. Then she nodded too. You're right. I want to be part of that change, too. Elizabeth felt her eyes fill with tears, but this time they weren't tears of fear or despair, but of hope and love. Tomorrow I'll call the office and announce my extended vacation, she said, and then we'll start planning our future. A new future. That night, lying in bed, Elizabeth thought about the struggle ahead. She knew she had a difficult road ahead of her, but now she had a goal that was more than just survival. She wanted to not just beat the disease, but to change her life, her family's life, maybe even the lives of others. The morning started early. Elizabeth awoke at first light, feeling a strange mixture of anxiety and determination. She got up quietly, trying not to wake Michael, and went out onto the balcony. The city below was already waking up. People were rushing to work, stores were opening, cars were driving down the streets. Ordinary life went on, and Elizabeth suddenly realized how much she wanted to be a part of this simple, everyday reality. When she returned to the bedroom, she saw that Michael was already awake and looking at her with concern. "How are you, darling?" he asked, holding out his hand. Elizabeth sat down next to him on the bed. "I'm fine, Michael. I really am. I'm ready for what's ahead of us." He hugged her tightly, and for a moment they just sat in silence, supporting each other without words. After the breakfast they had prepared with Rachel, Elizabeth headed to her home office. It was time to make an important call. She dialed the number of her deputy, John Parker. John had worked with her for over a decade and was one of the few people she trusted completely when it came to business matters. "John, it's Elizabeth. Do we have a moment to talk?" "Of course, Elizabeth. Is something wrong? You haven't shown up at the office in days." Elizabeth took a deep breath. "John, I have something important to tell you. I've been diagnosed with a brain tumor." Silence hung on the other end of the line. Then John spoke softly. "Oh my God, Elizabeth, I don't know what to say." "It's all right, John. We don't know all the details yet, but the doctors are optimistic. However, I need to take an extended leave of absence for treatment and to reevaluate my priorities." Of course, John replied quickly. "We'll manage here. You need to focus on your health." Elizabeth smiled. It was exactly what she had expected to hear from John. "Thank you, John. I knew I could count on you. But there's something else." They spent the next hour discussing Elizabeth's plans to reorganize the company. She wanted to make the business more socially responsible, increase charitable programs, and improve working conditions for employees. "That's a big change, Elizabeth," John said when she was done. "Are you sure you want to do it now?" "I've never been more sure, John. This illness, it's made me rethink a lot of things. I want our company not just to make money, but to make the world a better place." After talking to John, Elizabeth felt relieved. The first step had been taken. Now it was time to focus on the treatment. The next weeks flew by in a whirlwind of medical tests, doctor consultations, and treatment planning. Elizabeth insisted on going back to Dr. Thompson's regular clinic, despite offers from the best private hospitals. "I trust her," she explained to Michael, "and I want to go through this as a regular person, not as a billionaire." Michael supported her decision, as he did in everything else. He was there for every appointment, holding her hand during every procedure. Rachel was an unexpected support, too. She took on many of the household chores, learned to cook the healthy meals the doctors recommended, and even started looking into the latest research on brain tumor treatments. "Mom, look at this," she said one evening, showing Elizabeth an article on her tablet. "It talks about a new treatment method that is showing great results. Maybe we should discuss it with Dr. Thompson." Elizabeth was touched by her daughter's efforts. "Thank you, sweetheart. We'll be sure to discuss it at our next appointment." In parallel with her treatment, Elizabeth began to put her plans to change the company into action. She worked remotely, video conferencing from home and dictating letters when she felt well enough. One of her first projects was to create a foundation to help patients who couldn't afford expensive treatment. She used her connections and influence to bring attention to healthcare issues and the need to make quality medical care available to all. "You know," she told Michael one day as they were walking in a park near their home, "I never thought I'd say this, but this disease, it's changed me for the better." Michael squeezed her hand. "You've always been an amazing woman, Liz. It's just that now you're letting it show more openly." Elizabeth smiled, but then her face turned serious. "Michael, there's something I have to tell you. I've decided to give up chemotherapy." Michael stopped, shocked. "What? But why? The doctors said it was our best chance." Elizabeth shook her head. "I've thought about it a lot. I've seen what people go through during chemotherapy. I don't want to spend perhaps the last months or years of my life feeling sick and weak. I want to live, Michael. Really live." Michael looked confused. "But Liz, what if this is our only chance to beat the disease?" "We don't know that for sure," Elizabeth replied softly. "Dr. Thompson said there's a good chance the tumor is benign. We'll keep an eye on it, and if it starts to grow, then we'll look at other options. But right now, I want to focus on life, not the disease." Michael was silent for a long time, mulling over her words. Finally, he nodded. "I understand you, Liz, and I'll support whatever decision you make. But promise me that if things get worse—" "I promise," Elizabeth said, hugging her husband. "We will monitor the situation and make decisions together." The news elicited a strong reaction from Rachel when they told her that evening. "Mom, you can't take that risk," she exclaimed. "You have to use every possible treatment." Elizabeth gently took her daughter's hands. "Sweetheart, I understand your concern, but this is my body and my life. I want to live it the way I think is right." Rachel looked like she wanted to argue further, but then just hugged her mother, pulling her tightly against her. In the months that followed, the Montgomery family's life changed dramatically. They began to spend more time together, traveling, trying new things. Elizabeth began writing a memoir, sharing her experiences and reflections on life, business, and overcoming challenges. Her story inspired many people. People wrote her letters, sharing their stories of struggling with illness and life's challenges. Elizabeth responded to each letter, finding a new calling. The company changed, too. Under John's leadership and with Elizabeth's continued input, it became one of the leaders in corporate social responsibility. They launched small business support programs, environmental initiatives, and expanded philanthropic efforts. One day, nearly a year after her initial diagnosis, Elizabeth was sitting in Dr. Thompson's office again, waiting for the results of another MRI. "Mrs. Montgomery," the doctor said as she entered the office with a smile on her face, "I have some good news. The tumor has not grown. In fact, we're seeing a slight reduction in its size." Elizabeth felt tears of relief come to her eyes. Michael, sitting next to her, squeezed her hand tightly. That's wonderful," Elizabeth exhaled. "Thank you, Dr. Thompson, for everything." Walking out of the clinic, Elizabeth stopped on the sidewalk, looking at the city around her. She remembered standing in the same place a year ago, scared and unsure of the future. "What are you thinking about?" Michael asked, putting his arm around her shoulders. Elizabeth smiled, looking up at her husband. "I'm thinking about how much has changed this year and how much more there is to do." They walked down the street, holding hands. An unknown future lay ahead of them, but Elizabeth knew now that whatever happened, she would meet it with an open heart and the support of those she loved. That evening, the whole family gathered in the living room. Rachel brought a bottle of champagne to celebrate the good news. "Here's to Mom," she said, raising her glass, "to her strength, courage, and for teaching us to appreciate every moment of life." Elizabeth felt a lump come up to her throat. "Thank you, sweetheart. But this toast isn't just for me. It's to all of us, to our family, to our love, to our ability to grow and change together." Michael raised his glass. "And to the future. Whatever challenges it brings us, we will face them together." They clinked glasses, and the clinking of glasses filled the room. Elizabeth looked around at her family, the husband with whom she had been through so many trials, the daughter who had grown into a strong and caring woman. She thought about her company, which was now not only profitable, but making the world a better place, about the people she was able to help through her experience and resources. A year ago, the diagnosis had seemed like the end of everything for her. Now she realized it was the beginning, the start of a new chapter in her life, more meaningful and fulfilling than ever before. It had been 5 years since the day Elizabeth first heard her diagnosis. In that time, many changes had occurred, both in her life and in the lives of those around her. Montgomery was now known not only for her financial success, but also for her social initiatives. The foundation Elizabeth created to help brain tumor patients had helped thousands of people get the treatment they needed. Rachel, who was initially skeptical of the company's changes, was now head of corporate social responsibility and was a passionate advocate for those who needed help. Michael, always supportive of his wife, found a new calling in working with support groups for families facing serious diagnoses. His experience and compassion helped many through difficult times. Elizabeth herself became a well-known speaker, sharing her story at conferences and in the media. Her book, Life After Diagnosis, became a bestseller and an inspiration to many. But most importantly, Elizabeth learned to live each day, appreciate small joys, and find happiness in simple things. She was no longer the woman who lived only for work and success. Now she was full of life, love, and gratitude.